welcome back to another episode of the Sly Hooper Podcast, an off-season edition of the Sly Hooper Podcast, brought to you by the Blue Wire Hustle Podcast Network. Speaking of Blue Wire Hustle, it's another Blue Wire Hustle collaboration, and it's a little bit of a different hoops conversation today. We have on Brian Scott. He is the host of the Injured List podcast, part of the Blue Wire Hustle Podcast Network. He also does a clubhouse show every Thursday, and it's going to be ramping up as the NFL season starts. And he basically talks about injuries on that as well. Brian has a very extensive history in the medical field, specifically in the sports medical field as well. Longtime physician assistant, orthopedic surgeon, has been in sports medicine for nearly 15 years. And it was a very dope and informative conversation that we had, and specifically just wanted to talk about the bubble, its lingering effects, how much did the bubble play a role in the rash of injuries we saw this year, and, you know, we just go all over the place with a bunch of topics because, of course, there's a load management topic and all that stuff. And so, again, it was a very informative podcast, one of the more fun podcasts I've done, because I feel like as a Sixer fan, and, you know, a lot of Sixer fans have podcasts nowadays, you're really not a Sixer fan with a podcast until you have somebody in the medical field on your podcast to talk about injuries to your players because of the Sixers' extensive history with injuries. But Brian is able to simply explain, you know, all the things we talk about some injuries with specific players, and all that good stuff. So without further ado, here's Brian Scott, host of the Injured List podcast. Hello and welcome. We are here with Brian Scott, the host of the Injured List podcast, part of the Blue Wire Hustle Podcast Network. So fellow Blue Wire Hustler here, little collaboration. Brian, first of all, thank you for hopping on the Sly Hooper podcast.
Yeah, Jordan, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so obviously, since it's in the name, it's a basketball podcast, so we're going to get to the hoops part in a second. A little bit of a different kind of hoops conversation because we're obviously going to be going into injuries and all that stuff. But actually, I wanted to, you're a guest on my podcast, so, you know, whenever I invite the guest in, we want to get to know the person. So let's start with your background. I was looking at your website, theinjuredlist.com. Great laid out website, by the way. I would have no clue how to make a website like that. But you have a pretty long history working with injuries, sports injuries, working in sports injury related field. So why don't you give the listener your background, how you got into wanting to, you know, work as a physician assistant and be in orthopedic surgery and work with other sports organizations and all that stuff.
Yeah, so, you know, it didn't start that way, to be honest with you. You know, I, like a lot of young kids back in the day and even today, had aspirations of becoming a professional athlete. And, you know, when you hit the ninth grade and you're on the freshman team and you're the shortest guy, the stockiest guy,
yeah.
Can't jump the highest or run the fastest, you realize pretty quickly that those aspirations are probably...
I was a 6-foot flat center in high school, and then I realized I was like, all right, maybe it's time to quit.
Yeah, well, I was even 5'7" doesn't get you very far. So you know, but I did have a passion for the games and the sports, and was always part of my youth growing up. And you know, I always had an interest in some type of medicine or medical field. And I originally started out my career actually as an athletic trainer, which for those people that don't know, if you're watching sports on TV and when you see the athletes get hurt, the guys that run out on the field are usually the athletic trainers. And those guys' jobs are to basically prepare the athletes for competitions, help with injury preventions, treatment of acute injuries that happen on the field of play. And they basically the guys behind the scene that keep the players healthy on the field, performing at a high level. And then also working with the doctors, the PAs, and the other healthcare professionals to maintain their athletes' conditioning and all that stuff. So I started my career out as one of those guys, and I did that for about 5 years. And then during that time in that career, I worked very closely with a lot of orthopedic surgeons and physician assistants. And so gradually my career kind of shifted more to wanting to do that work, which really incorporated more of these surgical treatments and being in the operating room, working in the physician's office. So it's a little bit more comprehensive, a little bit less of the sports stuff, but I still had a very active involvement in athletics while I was working in New York, where I'm originally from. I
Right.
was helping with St. John's University athletics. I was helping with some other local Division II schools and colleges, high school athletics throughout my career. I had a brief stint as a trainer in minor league baseball for a season back in 2001 with the AAA team for the Orioles at the time. So I've always been around it, even as a PA. I work with the foot and ankle specialist now down in Charlotte, North Carolina, and we treat athletes all the time, both current professional, amateur, and collegiate athletes, and former professional, amateur, and collegiate athletes. So I've got a very broad experience array. Yeah, I've been in the field, I've been in the locker room, I've been in the operating room. So I kind of got a lot of different views of how it all goes down and how it all plays out as far as sports injuries and how these athletes deal with them, what goes on behind the scenes. So, that kind of translated into me producing my own podcast to kind of help give a different perspective on all this stuff, help provide some insight and education to those of you who have your own sports podcasts and need somebody on to kind of delve into that stuff. Or your fans who have fantasy sports rosters that they need to kind of tweak.
It's interesting because there's like 10,000 bajillion sports podcasts now, and I haven't really run into too many sports podcasts that talk about stuff on the injury side. Now, I'm a Sixer fan, so I listen to a lot of Sixers podcasts, and there's always 10,000 injuries. The long history of injuries with the Sixers. We are experts in WebMD, obviously not a great source or whatever, but we as soon as an injury happens, we try to research it because we're just used to it at this point. But I listen to a bunch of Sixers podcasts, and they always, whenever a big injury happens, they always have, an orthopedic surgeon or a physical trainer or somebody like that on to explain what happened. So I feel like now I'm part of the lineage of whatever Sixer fan has a podcast, they finally have a doctor on. Yeah. So, so I feel like, kind of, broken into now as a Sixer fan. I'm
glad I could help in any way to make that happen.
We will get to the Sixers later, by the way, but okay. I'm curious, what sports what was your sport of choice? Were you a multi-sport athlete? Did you have a preference? What sports were you into when you were younger?
So from a playing perspective, I always played basketball, baseball, started out actually playing a lot of soccer for many, many years up until I got into about junior high. And then due to various factors, which I think is pretty common with a lot of United States youth, is they end up graduating from soccer and doing something else.
Yeah, soccer was my first sport in third grade. And then, I did play basketball, but it wasn't like, a serious league or anything. I mean, I was like 4 or 5, but by the time I had third grade, like soccer was like my first serious quote unquote, sport, I guess. And then I just graduated from that after a year. I guess that kind of works.
That seems to be the case for a lot of American youth these days, even back when we were kids. Soccer seems to be the one that the parents often got their kids involved in at a very young age, and they kind of gravitated toward other sports as they got older. And
I was the best third grade goalie ever. It's an unfounded claim, but I'm going to stick with it.
Yeah, in retrospect, I kind of wish I had stuck with soccer more. I think I was built more for that,
Yeah, for sure.
Frame.
All right, so I guess we could transition to the NBA now that the season's over. Summer League is finally over. And there's a respite now in the NBA season, considering it's damn near a 12-month sport now with free agency and all that stuff. So the reason I wanted to have you on is I wanted to kind of break down. It's felt like a long season starting from October of 2019. And, we're here obviously now in August of 2021. There was a short break in between. First of all, obviously the season got suspended in the 2019-20 season. And, they came back right around August or so, late July, with the Orlando bubble. First of all, I wanted to know what were your initial thoughts when the bubble happened? And then after that, we could kind of just go into, the really shortened off season. I was kind of surprised at how early the league started this past season. But what were your initial thoughts heading into the bubble? And after the bubble ends, you're hearing like, oh, they might start the season in January, which seems logical, to give the players some time. But then they surprise us, and it's like, hey, we're starting December 22nd, and it's like, whoa, wait. But what were your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Wow. A lot. I had a lot of opinions back in the day when all this started to kind of develop. When you went from a abrupt end to the season due to COVID, and then with all the restrictions going on, and this, went across the board, even to the athletes and the staff and the organizations, people weren't able to get together. The training sessions were limited. Guys couldn't find gym time. It was really difficult for everybody. Then to bring them back and throw them into this bubble and expect them to go full speed all out, for a very shortened time frame and a very intense time, was really concerning from an injury standpoint. I think for the most part, a lot of the teams made it through that period pretty unscathed from what I can recollect. Now, when you look at the then transition to the 2020 season, short turnaround times, shortened season, but, intense, more compacted. Again, you're worried that, these these athletes usually are creatures of habit and routine.
Yep.
Especially when it comes to season after season after season.
They're very maniacal with their routine.
Yeah. And rightfully so. I mean, I would be too.
Oh, yeah.
You want to peak at a certain time during the year. You want to make sure you don't overtrain. You want to make sure you're ready to go into the season. And all of that is calculated. It's all measured. It's all planned. And when these things started happening around 2019, 2020, it threw everything into a state of flux. And, that can be really difficult to do. And if you're one of these athletes who maybe was trying to do it on your own and you didn't have somebody who could guide you, like a personal trainer or some type of fitness expert or nutritionist, those guys were probably doomed to fail at some point over the last year or so.
Yeah.
And it's hard to say because we don't know what goes on behind the scenes. We don't know the intimate details, but you can probably, or some of these players will probably tell you themselves that their whole training regimen got thrown out of whack. Their conditioning was probably not where it normally would be, and they would probably tell you more than anybody that these were probably some of the contributing factors to some of their injuries or possibly their teammates' injuries. So, I think for the most part, though, being a professional athlete, it's not like looking at a recreational athlete. They have all the resources there that are available to them. Mm-hmm. So even in a shortened season or even in a short turnaround off season, their onus is really on them. I mean, they can do it. It just takes a lot of planning. It takes a lot of execution and dedication. And, most of these guys have the resources there to do it. So I am a little concerned, though, about the turnaround time. I think that is probably one of the bigger concerns I've had is they just got done playing what would they play, like 60 games or something?
Yeah, they played 72 games this season.
I mean, that's basically a full year.
I mean, and they ended in mid-July, and
it's much later than they normally end.
Yep, exactly. It usually ends around early June, mid-June.
And then what do they usually kick in? October?
Yep, October. So training camp starts next month.
Yeah, I mean, that's like super short.
Yeah.
And that to me can spell disaster.
Yeah, and I do want to get into that because that was one of the genesis for me to ask you to come on was I really think that this upcoming season, like the bubble is still going to linger into this season because of the rash of injuries we have seen this year. Like, I feel like injuries have kind of gone up lately over the years anyway, but for this was like abnormal. And I guess my next question before we get into that is, how much blame, or I guess blame isn't the right word. I can't find the correct word right now. Sorry, my coffee is still kicking in. But I'm just wondering how much credence should we give to the bubble for all these injuries? Because honestly, some of these injuries were freak injuries. Like, I mean, Jamal Murray's ACL injury was the one that comes to mind against the Warriors. I've watched basketball, or we've all watched basketball all our lives. That's kind of that's a normal. I mean, it sounds terrible, but it's a run of the mill. That's a ACL injury that happens a lot in basketball. But then there's other wear and tear injuries that happen to the other Denver Nuggets, specifically the Final Four teams in the bubble playoffs: the Heat, the Celtics, the Lakers, the Nuggets. They all got eliminated in the first round one way or another because of injuries, or for these past playoffs because of injuries and COVID and all that stuff. But how much credence should we give the how much did the bubble really play a role in all? Was it all these injuries? Was it most of them? Like, that's where I struggle to I guess that's where my lack of knowledge in the medical field comes in. But it's always that debate of how much did it really factor in.
Yeah, I mean, anything that we can gather is based on observational data, right? It's not hard science. It's just
Right.
from what we're seeing, and we don't necessarily have access to the information. Now, what I will tell you is that most of these professional sports organizations have injury tracking software that they use.
Mm-hmm.
So they are able to tell whether or not there's an aberration in one particular injury from year to year, if it had something to do with the bubble. They can look at all that statistical data and come up with actual hard evidence. So whether or not they do that, and if they release that information to the public, who knows? But I can guarantee you they have it somewhere sitting in a computer file.
Yeah.
Now, just from an anecdotal evidence point of view, I don't know if it necessarily was any different than what it probably would have been if you extrapolated that over 3 regular or 2.5 regular seasons with normal time frames in between. I think it just got, sometimes the media will take these things and kind of run with it too, because it impacts the game so much more when you now are in a bubble with 8 other teams fighting for that championship that you normally wouldn't have this type of playing format. So anytime especially if a big name player goes down, now all of a sudden, whoa, it's the injury and it's the bubble, right? They got to tie it back to something because it makes good story. So I don't lend too much credence to the bubble being the major factor, but it definitely plays a role, and it's definitely significant.
Yeah.
Because like we talked about before, it changes the timeline, it changes the preparation that these guys do, and from a physiologic standpoint, if you're not able to recover, rest, heal, and condition in a normal time frame or to what your body requires, then it's going to throw things off, and it's going to potentially predispose you to some type of injury. So you can definitely relate that to the bubble and the shortened season, the shortened off season.
Yeah, and also, like, there were teams like, for example, the Washington Wizards. I know the Phoenix Suns, excuse me. They didn't play basketball for like a week because of COVID protocols. So then they had to make up all these games. So there are definitely a lot of contributing factors. But definitely the bubble did have some kind of role in it. And how much, obviously, like you said, it's all anecdotal, and, the media definitely has a part in it, and I guess technically I am part of the media, so I will take my blame in that as well. But it's just I see all these injuries happening to these stars, and then we talked about it earlier. The finals ended, these past finals, congratulations to the Milwaukee Bucks again, ended in about mid-July, which is about a month later than usual when the season ends. And then now training camp's going to start in September because they want to, get back on track to having the normal 82-game season and things like that. So this is still kind of a quick turnaround. And I'm just wondering, do you think that it's going to be an issue again like the last time, or is this going to be something that'll play another role in maybe another injury-riddled season? I mean, guys like Kawhi, obviously Jamal Murray, stars that suffered devastating injuries, they're going to be out for a while, especially since they suffered these injuries like late into the season. But how do you look at this quick turnaround and how it's going to relate to this upcoming season, the 2021-22 NBA season?
Yeah, so it's going to impact guys like them significantly, because now you're changing basically the time frame with which they have to get their surgery done, get their rehab in, and then be cleared to play and come back to basketball activities. So you have thrown off that entire time frame now based on the start of the season, the end of the last season. And it all can get traced back to when their injury occurred, because if it was during an out of normal time frame, then it's going to throw off everything that comes after that. So Kawhi definitely is affected. And, one guy that keeps coming to my mind who wasn't actually even playing through all this, but had been injured the year before was Klay Thompson.
Yep.
Who is to say that some of this didn't affect his rehab while he was coming back from an ACL and potentially may have caused his Achilles tendon rupture?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm actually working on a video about the Warriors for my YouTube channel, and I well, obviously I didn't go into the extent of his injury, but it just made me realize like Klay Thompson suffered 2 devastating injuries like before the season even started. So
yeah, and you could probably put some type of causality on the whole pandemic and the restricted access to rehab facilities and stuff.
And the Achilles was the opposite leg, I believe, too.
Yeah, I believe it was, if you're not mistaken. I think so. And, would that have happened in a normal course of a year where he may have, been able to kind of get in the gym more?
Had his usual resources.
Right. And, did that maybe pressure him to alter his schedule because he was trying to get back for the 2021 season? I mean, we don't know. We're not privy to that information, but you could speculate that, and it wouldn't be out of this world. I think so those guys aside, I think the only other people that this is probably going to really affect more are going to be those older veterans who went deep into the playoffs.
Right.
I think that you'll see those guys probably use some more of that load management that we hear about all the time.
Oh yeah, we're going to talk about that.
Yeah, we're going to see a lot of that this year from those type of players. And one guy who comes to my mind is like Chris Paul. You'll probably see LeBron doing that.
Yeah. I don't think Kawhi's going to play this year.
No, I would be shocked.
Considering how we've seen how he handles injuries and how extra cautious he is, and rightfully so.
Well, if this is the same knee he was dealing with issues a couple of years ago, where he was basically just like, I'm not playing, then he's in a world of he's gonna have a world of problems.
Yeah, I'm actually worried about post-30s Kawhi. Like, obviously, we don't want to speculate, and we want these players to be healthy because basketball is fun, and it's fun when Kawhi Leonard's on the court. But with these leg injuries and his chronic, I guess, leg issue was cropping up last season too, before the bubble started, before the season got suspended, and that's why he was sitting out all these games. I think Doc Rivers said him and Paul George together practiced like one time, which is insane to me to think about, considering basketball is so rhythmic and chemistry plays a big part in it. But yeah, I can't imagine Kawhi is going to be playing at any point this season.
I highly doubt it.
Yeah. What was that?
Oh, I'd be shocked if he stepped on a basketball court at all this year.
Yeah, and also with Murray, like with Jamal Murray, even if he does come back like halfway, 60% through the season, what is he going to look like? How long is it going to take for him to get back to that percentage of the player he was before the injury happened, which was really damn good? I feel like, well, not just obviously the bubble factors in, but I just feel like this one long kind of extended season, it's just going to bleed into the next season, and because the NBA is going to definitely trying to get back on track with the 82-game season.
I'm telling you, some of these guys with some of these injuries they've had, with the lack of the normal time frame, the lack of access, the lack of time to recover and heal and train with their partners and teammates, some of these guys, it's going to take like a year and a half to 2 years for them to get over this. The one guy who this actually worked in his favor and who I think did the smartest thing ever was Kevin Durant.
Yeah, I knew you were going to bring him up.
And he decided not to play in that shortened 1920 season. I think that was the smartest move he could have done for himself, because what he essentially did was gave himself enough time to heal and do some more therapy and get ready for this past 2020.
Yeah, skipped out on the bubble and gave him an extra, 6 months? Like, he basically had 18 months to recover.
Yeah, and that window of time, that 18 months to almost 2 years, is like where a lot of guys will finally wake up one morning and be like, hey, I forgot I even had my Achilles fixed, or I forgot I had my knee surgery, or I forgot, because it takes the body physiologically almost sometimes that long to kind of recoup and recover and heal. And that process, initially happens very quick, but then that complete remodeling and the body getting used to that new physiology and all that stuff, it can take 18 months sometimes. So I think
John Wall's another one that comes to mind because he was basically out for 2 years, and obviously with the longer season and stuff, it gave him more time in. He's not the same John Wall in Washington, but when he first stepped on the court and I was watching the Rockets early on in the season, I was like, whoa, he's still like faster than, well, obviously he's an athlete. He's a top percentile athlete among humans, but he was still kind of really fast.
He looked good. He looked good, better than he's looked in the last few years.
So, so I guess actually I just thought of another question because I'm interested in this too, because the Achilles injury, that's the death sentence injury. I feel like injuries have improved over the years, like torn ACLs, like you recover from that, you come back stronger, all that stuff. All these knee injury, like I feel like even a torn meniscus back in like the 60s and 70s or the 50s, like that was a death sentence for a basketball player, but now players just come back from that like nothing. What were you thinking as somebody from the medical field watching Kevin Durant still be Kevin Durant pretty much on this, coming back from this devastating injury? We're really the only player we can go back to in history that actually fully came back from and played well after the injury was Dominique Wilkins. Like, what were you thinking when you were watching this, the season he had?
Well, and I did a whole episode on Achilles tendon injuries, like last year, I think. So if you guys want to go back and listen to it, and I talked about Dominique Wilkins as one of those guys. He was very young when that happened, actually. He was like in his 20s.
Yeah.
So he wasn't nearly as to the age of Kevin Durant. I was concerned. This injury, Kobe had this injury, and it wasn't long before he ended up retiring. He was never the same when he came back from his Achilles tendon injury.
I think it was 34 when that Achilles injury happened too.
Yeah. And it could be pretty devastating. You lose some explosiveness, you lose some strength, you lose some power. No matter how good some of our surgical techniques and some of our instrumentation has gotten over the years, there are some things that we just can't change, right? And, you rupture a tendon, we fix it, but it's still a tendon at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And it still heals the same. We can't speed up that process. We can't change that process. We can make the surgery more reliable. We can make the rehab more accelerated, but the end of the day, it's still the same tissue. It's still the same anatomy, same physiology behind it all. Mm-hmm. So, I was concerned, but the fact that he gave himself that extra 6 months during the bubble, I think was huge, and didn't try to rush back for that. Yeah. I think that is what really salvaged him for this past year and years going forward. So he looked great. I mean, he looked great. You would never know he had an Achilles tendon rupture.
Yeah, and I think if it was, like you said, if it was like a normal, if the season didn't stop, and he, had to come back for in a normal timeline, maybe he doesn't look the same, and we're thinking, like this is Kevin Durant starting this fast decline, but now he just signed a big fat extension. So
now look, there's a lot of other things that go into this too. I mean, when we talk about Achilles tendon ruptures, there's different parts of the tendon that can be torn. And, there's a little bit of luck that plays into this. I mean, if you have a tear where the tendon starts to blend into the muscle tissue, we call that the muscular tendinous junction. Well, that's a completely different animal. And in some cases, much more difficult to surgically repair and to bounce back from to an elite level like that. You can also have a tear that's closer to the attachment site of the tendon, closer to the bone on the heel. That also can change our surgical approach and technique, which can then also change the recovery. So there's a little bit of luck involved. I'm not privy to all that information, and most of us won't be. They don't usually ever get reports in that much detail. The only way you'll know that is if you're part of the surgical or medical team taking care of those guys. Yeah. But without knowing some of those finer details, it's hard to predict with 100% accuracy how well they're going to bounce back. So we have to go with laws of averages and things like that.
Of course.
Durant's tear may have been mid substance Achilles tendon, mid tendon, which are the most ideal because those typically heal the best and are surgically repaired the easiest, come together really nice. And guys are usually now, we've accelerated the rehabs a little bit more than what we used to do years ago. Years ago, we lock them up in a cast for like 4 to 6 weeks before we started them doing any therapy. Nowadays, we actually get them going a little bit more. Earlier. Yeah, and the reason for that is because we've changed a little bit of the technique that we do it. the repair, and we've changed some of the materials that we use for the sutures that we use for the repair. So, that is just advancements in medicine and equipment and technology. But as far as everything healing, again, it's still the same. The human body hasn't changed.
Yeah, exactly.
Just some of the resources and technologies that we have to create a good environment for these things to heal. So, there's definitely some luck in it. Meniscus tears are not all the same. ACL tears are not all the same. We talk in generalities and we get reports, ACL tear, but sometimes there's other structures that are injured.
Yeah, exactly. So one more question before I wanted to move on to some certain players. And you say meniscus tear. Any Sixer fans who happen to catch this podcast, that's just a trigger word for us. So when we talk about injuries like Kevin Durant's injury, obviously before that initial Achilles injury happened, he was out for a good chunk of the playoffs that year, the 2019 playoffs, because he had a calf injury, and those are usually tricky. Obviously, I'm not in the medical field, but when you watch sports for a long time, like hamstring injuries and calf injuries are the most tricky ones because they could just, react again. Even if you come back and do all the right procedures and all that stuff, it could just pop back up again. So I'm wondering, when it comes specifically to that, and also, I guess, the broader topic of connecting the dots between what injury caused the next injury and stuff, how do you think, I guess, how much of that is true, like connecting the calf injury that he had in that same leg to the Achilles and him coming back? Like, how do you feel about, is obviously, again, we're not privy to all the information. We can only just speculate with what we got and what we've seen over the past, and unless you're actually in the room. But connecting the dots with injuries, how much of it is accurate? Of course, I guess it's a tough question, but it seemed like that calf injury, when when he came back in I believe it was game 5 of that finals, people were obviously worried, but I guess he was fine in warmups. They cleared him to play. And then, he looked like Kevin Durant again. He hit like 3 threes and was like, could they come back and win this series? But then boom, the Achilles injury happens. I mean, how was the calf connected in some sort of way? Like, is it like a kinetic thing? Like, obviously we heard the terms like kinetic chain. How much credence do you put into that as somebody who is more versed in this than I am?
That's a tough question because it's really hard to kind of, and hindsight's 2020, right? I mean, like, we could go back and probably find a myriad of things that could potentially have led to his Achilles tendon rupture. Mm-hmm. But we
all go down those YouTube rabbit holes.
Yeah, exactly. And but this is one of those injuries, man. When that Achilles tendon goes, it goes, and sometimes there's never any
explanation.
Yeah. I can vividly recall the first Achilles tendon rupture I witnessed from the sidelines, and it was a referee during a basketball game.
Oh wow!
The guy was doing great, and boom, one step. That's all it took. That guy, and I vividly remember, we were asking him and evaluating him, and never had any problems. Just the thing just let go.
It just happened.
Yeah. And that's the nature of the beast, unfortunately, for those injuries. But I mean, we could nitpick it apart. There was probably something going on there physiologically that led eventually to that tendon rupturing. Whether or not it bothered Kevin Durant is very subjective, and he's the only one that can tell you. And in some cases, they don't even know because it doesn't bother them. Mm-hmm. I've seen people who have huge bone spurs by their Achilles are super thickened, and these aren't even athletes, right? And they have no pain whatsoever. And you get an MRI of that Achilles, and you can see that the consistency of the tendon, the quality of the tendon is not nearly what it should be, and it's not healthy at all. But yet they have no pain, they can function just fine. And athletes are no different in some regard. He may have had something going on there. He may have had some type of inflammation in the tendon. He may have had a partial tear at some point, and maybe it just never bothered him. But don't forget, when you're comparing elite athletes to the general population, these guys get paid a lot of money. There's a lot of pressure on them to be out there to perform.
Yep.
And, they've got pressure not just from their immediate circle and the organization and the fans, but themselves too. I mean, they've got to live up to a certain degree, level of playability,
level of excellence.
Yeah, exactly. Like, these are guys that are, especially Durant. I mean, he's vying for the Hall of Fame, right? Like,
oh yeah, if he retired right now, he's in the Hall of Fame automatically.
right. But does he want to go out like sitting out because of a little Achilles pain or something? And maybe not, and maybe he put that pressure on himself. It's hard to say. So I try not to get too hung up on the what ifs and what may have caused, and what you got to, from a healthcare perspective, you deal with things as it come to you.
Yeah, you kind of have to in your position. Yeah. I get that totally.
And I can tell you from experience, and these guys have the top-notch care. I mean, the training staff, the medical staff, and like I said before, the resources they have. So there's no doubt in my mind that they did everything that they could, and they did everything appropriately to make sure that this was not going to happen. But in the end of the day, you can only do so much. If it's going to go, it's going to go.
And it's Kevin Durant. So not only is he a top percentile athlete, he's like a top percentile professional athlete. Correct. So he probably has like even more stuff that we probably never even heard of or whatever.
Durant, historically speaking, this is not a guy that's often injured, often missing games.
Nope.
I mean, he's a gamer.
He had that Jones fracture in 2014, but that was about it. Yeah. Let's go over a few players real quick, because I'm interested in Kawhi Leonard, because the dunk that he got injured on was pretty routine dunk, and I guess like you said, that's the nature of the beast. Sometimes it kind of just happens. I thought he landed normal. I thought he looked fine afterwards, but comes out that he Shams Charania of The Athletic reported initially in the days after that it was a partially torn ACL. The Clippers really didn't say anything for like a month and a half, and then eventually confirmed it. But as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, a partially torn ACL versus a fully torn ACL, that doesn't really make a difference surgery-wise. The timeline is still the same. Why is that?
So anatomically speaking, the ACL ligament can be looked at as having two distinct bundles. It is hard to kind of describe without showing you a model, but
right.
So you can have a tear of one of those bundles, and technically that's a partial tear. Mm-hmm. You can strain microscopic numbers of fibers. Technically, that's a partial tear, but usually it's graded. But the big thing with the ACL is it's a primary stabilizer of the knee joint. It's a very, very important ligament for rotational stability and translational stability of the leg. And any compromise in that stability, whether it be through a partial tear or complete rupture, if it causes the joint to be unstable and causes laxity within those ligaments to the point where it's not functioning normally, then it's very rare that you can treat that conservatively without reconstructing it. So when I hear that in the news, and I hear the reports, partial this, partial that, listen, I've almost never in my career come across a partial ACL injury.
I've hardly ever heard a partial ACL tear even reported.
Well, it's there. I mean, but I was going to say is in a professional athlete that doesn't get treated surgically, that's a recipe for disaster. If you were, I mean, I've had plenty of patients where we've gone in there surgically and we swore that the ACL was torn both clinically and with MRI confirmation. You get in there and you're staring at the thing and you can see that it's intact and it looks like it's where it needs to be. But then you start kind of tugging on it. You kind of start feeling it and then you're like, well, it may be there, but this is not functioning like a normal ACL.
Right.
And, so it really doesn't matter whether it was partial or not. The question that has to be answered in most cases is that thing functioning normally? And the likely answer is that it's not. And in that case, you have no choice but to reconstruct it.
And
doesn't change the timeline, doesn't change the recovery. ACL reconstruction is an ACL reconstruction.
Yeah.
They experimented back in the day with doing like partial reconstructions and repairs. And historically, those have very bad outcomes.
I was going to say that sounds like a bad idea.
Yeah, there's really no way to kind of adequately and successfully repair that ligament. You almost always have to perform some type of reconstructive surgery. Now you can leave some of the intact fibers if they're normal and healthy behind, but you're still going to put some type of synthetic or we don't use that anymore, but you're still going to put some type of graft through there, whether it be a tendon from the other part of the leg or cadaver or whatever. Most guys nowadays are doing it from either the patellar tendon, which is the tendon that goes from the kneecap to the tibia.
That one's a devastating one too, the patella tendon.
Yeah, or the quad tendon, where they take a portion. And so to reconstruct the ACL, what they'll do is they'll take a portion of those tendons, not the whole thing, but just a portion to reconstruct the ACL. And you can do that with the hamstring tendon too. Some guys will do the hamstring. So there's various ways that we can do it. But
so what's the science behind getting stronger after an ACL injury? Because I've heard that too, like, you know, you obviously rehab after you get surgery, you rehab, but the leg is somehow stronger. How does that work?
I'm not so sure if that's really true. The ligament itself is usually
that's why we have you on, to confirm or deny.
I mean, the goal of rehab is to get that leg strong, and you want it. The hamstring muscle group is really the most important when it comes to ACL stability and knee joint stability, because that's often the muscle group that's the weakest that leads to those injuries. So they definitely do a lot of focus on the hamstring muscles, the quadricep muscles, which are the muscles in the front of the thigh, because those help provide stability to the kneecap, and, you know, also provide significant strength with deceleration, so like slowing down from a sprint. And if those muscles aren't strong, then you risk also ACL injury again. So there's that's, you know, always been known, and that really hasn't changed much. But, you know, the ligaments reconstructed initially, they actually are much stronger when you put them in initially, because you're actually tensioning them, intentionally tight. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you're kind of winding
it tight, because physiologically, as the healing process proceeds, they actually do get a little bit less taut and do loosen up to some degree. Yeah. And then as the body continues to mature that tendon and change the properties of it back into a ligament, then it eventually will tighten up again. So there's a period of time where the ligament is taut, and then kind of loses some of that tautness and then goes down, and actually you can be very easily re-injured. So that's why the timeline is usually 9 to 12 months, and it hasn't changed much over the years.
I am first. If you think you're having a hard time explaining, I totally, well, not totally, but I feel like I understand what you're saying more than most sports fans. Like I said, given the history with my basketball team and my, you know, years of going on WebMD and freaking out about how long a player's out and all that stuff.
Well, you know, the whole thing behind my thing is I try to be very clear and concise, and I talk to you as though I was seeing you in the office one-on-one.
Yeah.
And
this is great. Yeah. This is great.
And I don't like to use big medical terms. I try to keep it simple and easy to understand. I've done all that. I don't like doing it when I'm outside of work.
Yeah.
Or not talking to my colleagues or people in the field. So, you know, I try to make it easy to understand. I try to make it make sense as to why some of these things are occurring. So thank you.
Yeah, of course. So last few things before I let you go. So Joel Embiid, we are tied with him. Obviously, I have no problem with that. I've loved Joel Embiid since Kansas. I thought he should have been the number 1 pick in the draft, and then I was ecstatic when the Sixers got him at number 3. But obviously, he has an extensive injury history at this point, unfortunately, and he's a superstar, but he's always had the tag, well, if healthy. So before we get into Embiid's recent injury, just you as somebody from the medical field, I'm sure you have tracked, and I'm not sure if you've tracked all the weirdness that goes on with the Sixers organization when it comes to injuries and stuff, no matter how many front office members we change, but I'm sure you have tracked Embiid to some extent. So when you look at somebody that big and that skilled, I guess, when his injuries were first cropping up, he had the navicular bone injury, and then coupled with the back before the draft, and then he had to be out again he had to redo the navicular surgery. Just what were your thoughts on Embiid? Did you think he was going to be what he is now, given that his first 2 years he was basically had two devastating injuries that were historically that's death sentence for big men. What were your thoughts on Embiid initially and how you see him now? And I'm just worried, quite frankly. Ticking time bomb isn't the right word, but I'm worried about when Embiid turns like 32 and beyond. So what are your thoughts on Embiid and his future, I guess, prospects, health wise and things like that with his size?
Yeah, immediately when he was dealing with that foot stuff a couple years ago, what came to my mind was Yao Ming.
Yeah.
Yao Ming had a Jones fracture in his foot. It's a different injury than the navicular, but it's notoriously a problem for a lot of big men in the NBA who often have that injury. And it's one of those injuries that it can be difficult to get that bone to heal, whether you do surgery or not. And so,
because that's the part of the foot where the blood flow is least present, right?
correct. And when you're talking about Jones fractures, yes. To be honest, when I'm looking at Embiid, the thing that worries me the most are the low back stuff, man. Like those are some really difficult problems to treat.
Yeah, he's had a lot of back tightness issues over the years.
Tightness is something that most guys can work through, but if there's any structural problems in his back, like slip discs or herniations or bulging discs, that's when things become really, really difficult to manage and treat. So hopefully he doesn't have any of that. Spasms, tightness, that can be worked around. With regards to his most recent injury, I'm really not that concerned. But what does concern me is, again, the history, like you mentioned. I don't think he's ever played like more than 62 games in a single season.
He's played 61, I think. That was the max.
Yeah. Anytime you hear a stat like that, you got to worry why, right? Is it because he just can't handle the duration and intensity of the NBA season?
No, 63 and 64 were his his most games. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that seems to be a more common trend these days, for whatever reason. But with regard to his most recent injury, I'm not too concerned about it. Meniscus injuries are very common. He actually was playing through it, which is not usual also. If you pulled like 100 people off the street who had no pain in their knee and you got an MRI of their knee, there's a chance that you probably find a meniscus tear or some type of irregular looking meniscus in like 75 to 80 of them. Do you have to do anything about that? And does it cause them to have any problems? Probably not in most of them.
Well, that's what I was going to ask, because his rookie year, he tore the meniscus in his right knee and he needed surgery on it. I don't know what type of, I'm pretty sure he did the surgery where they took a portion of it. They might have, I don't know if they put it back together or took a portion out of it. Well, no, they probably didn't take a portion out, because that's the one where you come back quickly, right?
So when we're talking about the meniscus, it gets a little complicated. First of all, there's two of them in the knee. They are kind of like saucer-shaped structures that basically act like shock absorbers for your
the lateral and the medial, right?
Correct. Inside and outside, or outside and inside. And like I said before, you can have people walking around with partial tears of those structures all the time, and it may not bother them. But there's a lot of different variations in the type of tear that can occur and the location of the tearing. And that really dictates how you treat it and what the results are going to be. Most of the tears, if they're small little tears on the inner periphery of the meniscus, are usually just amenable to going in arthroscopically, meaning two small incisions, going in there with a camera, going in there with some instruments, and just cleaning it or debriding it out to get rid of that loose flap. Because it's basically like having a piece of paper here with a little tear at the edge. If you continue to use that piece of paper, if you pass it around from person to person, if you sit on it, put a book on it, whatever, eventually that tear is going to propagate and get bigger. Well, your meniscus reacts the same way. So you try to get to those tears if they're small and clean them up so that you have a nice clean edge to the meniscus to prevent it from propagating. And a lot of times the professional athletes, they're going to pull the trigger on doing a surgery like that much quicker than if it was you or me, because they don't want that to become a problem down the road. And to have a small little arthroscopic procedure, which is like an in and out thing, you're walking the fit back home, you can start rehab almost immediately. Most guys can even come back from that within a couple of weeks at that level. You and I probably like more like 6 weeks because, we don't have the resources. But
Yeah.
in a professional athlete, they could be back as quick as 2. You know what? Russell Westbrook had that. I mean, you would be surprised how many guys have probably had the procedure done without us even knowing, because it never makes the news, because some guys just wait till the off season to get it addressed. Some guys have it done and it doesn't even make the paper because they're back to action so quick. So that doesn't really worry me, but it's very few instances where you can actually repair that structure, because it just doesn't heal very well. It has an outer third that's more vascular. The inner 2/3 are not. Repairing them doesn't always work very well. So there's a lot of different variations in the type of injury that can occur there and the way you treat it. And that really dictates the recovery. It can also, those are also very important structures that prevent arthritis. So any damage to those structures over time, eventually you will start to develop some arthritic changes in your knee.
So Sixer fans shouldn't be worried about the fact that he didn't need surgery this summer, because one, they were pretty mum on it, but then Daryl Morey, after the NBA draft, he did a media availability. He pretty much said that Joel didn't need surgery and that he's fine. So we shouldn't be worried, because the injury he had, it was a small lateral meniscus tear in his left knee. And I'm assuming that is not getting surgery is not uncommon, but usually, like, whenever I see athletes get meniscus tears, like you said, they get surgery on it. So we shouldn't be worried about him not getting surgery.
Yeah, I mean, all it tells me is that it may not have really been bothering him as much as they thought. Or maybe when they found the tear on the MRI, it may not have coincided with what his symptoms were. And so rather than address it surgically and have to put him through that unnecessarily, they said, well, we'll just wait and watch and see how you do and do some rehab and give you some time to rest. And if it gets better, then we don't have to do anything. We'll just kind of watch it. So that could have happened like that too. It has to all make sense. It has to correlate, right? Like you can have pain on one part of your knee, but if the MRI doesn't show that there's anything going on there and your pain is somewhere else, well, then there's a chance that maybe that's not
something's
the real
amiss.
Maybe it's something else.
So last question.
Ironically, though, did you notice that in his new contract, they did not cover him for any catastrophic injury?
Nope. And it's complete. He's worth even with his injury history, I'm sure me and a lot of Sixer fans will tell you he's worth every penny. So
if he gets a catastrophic career-ending injury, then his contract gets voided. It's essentially what.
Yeah, that was in his first this extension, it's the full max, no BS like clauses or whatever. Also, he doesn't have an agent anymore, so he gets all that money himself. Okay. So get the bag, as we say. I wanted to end this episode on everybody's favorite topic. I think it's a generational topic between millennials and the previous generation, because it's the back in my day, we used to hike up a mountain, go down the hill, walk to school 5 miles, and then play a game through injuries. But load management, that has been a huge talking point for the last few years. Kawhi Leonard, as we mentioned earlier, kind of took it to its extreme logical limits. I guess my initial question is, I feel like load management has helped, but I also feel like I'm kind of in the middle on this. Like it's definitely helped. We've definitely gotten smarter with how we handle injuries, but I also think that some of it is just, that's the nature of the beast and it's unavoidable, like we were talking about earlier. So I'm just wondering, how do you see load management? How much do you think it has been effective over the years? And maybe have we gone overboard with load management, considering that there is also the money factor and, fans wanting to see these players? Like I could tell you, as somebody who is, I work in radio, the salary isn't that big yet, but we save up money. And is a once in a lifetime or twice a chance to see, an athlete. Well, now not anymore, because I can get press passes and stuff to a Kings game. But, when I was in college and stuff, for example, me and my friends saved up a lot of money to get Warriors tickets. This was like the 2014-15 season, the Warriors' first title season. And we wanted to see Steph Curry, Anthony Davis, and Klay Thompson, Warriors versus Pelicans. Anthony Davis got hurt 2 weeks before that. It was like an ankle sprain, and they were going to hold him out. It was a week before, actually. Then Klay Thompson hurt his ankle the week we were supposed to go to San Francisco. And then we only got to see Steph Curry, who shot like 4 of 20 that night. So it was fun, but it was like, oh man, but how do you feel about load management, and how much of an impact do you really think it's had, and maybe is it gone overboard at this point?
I think it all came about and developed purely because of Kawhi Leonard's situation a couple of years ago, when he basically was
the
just
Spurs
like,
popularized it.
Right, and that's what I'm referring to when he was on the Spurs, and he's basically like, I'm hurt, I'm not playing. And there was very little detail about what actually was the problem. And we knew that he had injuries to the knee, and this term load management, to me and to many people in my profession, just signified that he probably has more internal structural damage to that knee joint than we realize. And as a result, in order to prolong his career and play at a high level for a substantial number of years to come, he's going to have to shut it down from time to time to manage it. That's what it means to me. And I think that it has been taken, the term, and kind of run with in different directions, but not appropriately so. I don't think it really pertains to anything more than that.
The beauty and evil of the internet.
Yeah, exactly. Because there's really no reason, like, you're gonna have these things that kind of pop up from time to time. The human body is not meant or developed or designed to do these things that we're asking these athletes to do. It's just not. It's only through years of training and conditioning and practicing that they're able to do these things. The overhand baseball pitch is probably one of the best examples. When people blow their elbows and shoulders out, because we're not designed to throw a ball 90 plus miles an hour overhand. You don't hear about softball pitchers having these problems because that's a normal anatomical movement.
Right.
And you're going to see stuff like this in every sport. But to me, load management means he's probably got some arthritis in that knee that's more advanced than we probably even know, or that many people even will realize, because of the level that he's still able to play at. And in order to maintain that for any type of longevity, he's going to have to shut it down from time to time. And I think that's what that was all about. Unfortunately for him, now he's dealing with a whole new set of circumstances.
Yep.
And if that is the case, and now he's dealing with this ACL injury, that doesn't bode well for his future. Unfortunately. So hopefully that's not the case. But he's always been very tight-lipped about what's going on with him. And,
even with his own organization, weirdly.
Right. Well, the people around him are also like that, and the organizations that he's been on during these times have also been like that. So it's a red flag for me. Because it means to me that there's probably a lot more going on than we've ever will know about.
He's Brian Scott, a host of the Injured List podcast. Please check that out, as well as our other podcast on the Blue Wire Hustle podcast network. Brian, this was very informative and fun. So I really thank you for coming on. I'm gonna have to bring you on again at some point during the season in case some weird thoracic outlet syndrome story happens with the Sixers again or something like that, and we need you to explain to us why we shouldn't freak out and all that good stuff. But really appreciate you coming on, man.
Hey, it was my pleasure. I'm glad I could lend some insight and give you a little bit of more knowledge about what goes on in this world, and hopefully I could calm your nerves as a Sixers fan, not to get too panicked in this offseason here.
I don't think Sixer fans will ever calm down. That's just what we're, cursed with. It's a gift and a curse.
I lived in Philly for 2 years when I was in graduate school. I lived in Philly, so I know how it is. For all the
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Brian.
I can empathize.
Shout out to Brian once again for hopping on the podcast to talk injuries and indulge in my Sixers panic, so to speak. Very fun, very informative. Thank you for listening to the podcast. Give the podcast a 5 stars, if you will. Give a like and a review if you're so inclined. Please spread the word. And again, thank you for the support. And we'll be back to another solo episode next week, talking about, some of the free agency moves and summer league stuff now that stuff's over. Also, check out the Box Out Banter podcast with me and Chris Okamura. Thank you once again for listening. And until the next time, deuces.